in just to have it going, so I don't need to worry about that. I always was the teacher who started class 60 seconds early. Always made my students crazy.
I think I'm the annoying teacher who does the opposite, so.
No worries. No, I was always very clear with my students of like, I will call roll within like the first minute of class because I've been here that long. And so if you come in late, you have to come and tell me that you were here. All right, Ryan, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. I'm going to stop my own video and mute myself, but I will be here the whole session. Let me know if I can help with anything.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to my session today. So I've got a PowerPoint prepared that I'll do a screen share so you all can see it while I talk. Don't worry though, I don't plan to do a lot of talking in terms of lecturing. I hope for this to be a really interactive session. So we're gonna go ahead and get started here. Let me share my screen with you. All right, hopefully we can all see that. So the topic or title of this session is Ethics in Dungeons and Dragons in the Virtual Classroom. My name is Ryan Gabriel Windeknecht, and I am a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I'll say a little bit about kind of how I use games in the classroom and what exactly I do as we go through here. But first up, I wanted to give you an idea of what we'll be doing. So in today's session, we do have, and Kristen, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've got nearly 2 hours here, I think an hour and 50 minutes. So what I plan to do is I'm going to say a little bit up top about game-based learning. It's possible, if you're familiar at all with game-based learning, that you know what I'm going to be talking about here. I don't plan to say a whole lot, but I do want to just say enough to kind of set the stage for what I do in the classroom and what we'll be doing today. After that, I'm going to say a little bit specifically about tabletop role-playing games. Again, just to kind of give us some background for what I do and what we'll be doing together. We're then going to kind of focus in on a few areas from tabletop role-playing games and the kinds of role-playing games that I use. We're going to talk a little bit about player characters and character creation. And it's at this point we're going to start getting interactive. So when we get to this player character portion, we're going to take a little bit of time. We won't do kind of full scale what I do with my students, but we will take a little bit of time to create some characters for our next 2 activities. After we create our characters, we're going to go on kind of condensed dungeon crawl. I'll say a little bit about what that is for those who aren't familiar with that term, but we will be using our player characters to do, as I said, a condensed activity like what I would do in the classroom. After that, we'll say a little bit about monster encounters, and if we have time, fingers crossed, we will run a kind of condensed monster encounter. If you read the abstract for today's session, it only mentioned the monster encounter, but that monster encounter, as the abstract mentioned, will focus around a philosophical thought experiment. And after we get through all that, I'm hoping to leave, because this is a Zoom session, I do want to leave some time at the end for questions if we have them. Normally I like for my presentations to be really discursive if we're in person, and I kind of just take questions as I go. But to keep things moving smoothly here, as Kristen said, I think we'll just keep questions until we hit points when either we need to ask questions, and so I will stop every now and then and make sure we're on the same page. But I'll try to leave a good 15, kind of 20 minutes at the end here. So if we have questions, we can kind of talk about anything that wasn't clear, or if you're interested in hearing more about certain things that we went over, I'll try to save time for that. So if our session starts at 3 and we're scheduled till 4:50, I'll try to end around 4:30 for questions. And Kristen, if you could help me keep an eye on that, because I'm not the best, I would appreciate that. All right, so let me go ahead and jump in here. Like I said, I've got a few things to say up front, but I'm going to try to keep my comments to a minimum here. So let's say a little bit about game-based learning. When I say game-based learning throughout this talk, what I'll be referring to is just a type of gameplay that has defined learning outcomes. Often there's a distinction made between game-based learning on the one hand and gamification on the other. For reasons I don't have time to go into here, I'm not a huge fan of this division. It serves some purposes, but I think it kind of muddies the waters in other ways. Nonetheless, when I say game-based learning, I'm talking about full-blown games that have been designed for use in the classroom or other learning environments. So we are talking here about serious or educational games. The probably best known, or at least to my mind, the best known serious game on the market for higher ed is the Reacting to the Past series. This was first developed by Mark Carnes out of Barnard College, at least that's where the Reacting to the Past is out of. And for those who don't know, Reacting to the Past games are history games. They're part simulation, part role-playing game, where students take on historical figures in important historical moments. And these moments are picked at such that although they went one way historically, depending on what the students do through their characters, history could turn out differently. And that's actually part of the learning process, is to have these kind of counterfactual outcomes to help facilitate what actually did happen and why. But that's probably as I said, to my mind, the best known kind of serious game out there for higher ed. I said there, it is a role-playing game, and that is the type of game that I use, although mine's a bit more game and less simulation. So I use tabletop role-playing games in the classroom. And tabletop RPGs are games in which players who control individual characters and a game master who adjudicates on the rules and controls the rest of the world narrates a sequence of events to tell a story. Right? All that means is that we get a group of people together, we're telling a story together. Most of the players control one character in a typical RPG, and then you have another player who is the game master who's responsible for adjudicating the rules and playing any other non-player characters or parts of the world. Again, that's not, this definition is not going to cover every role-playing game out there, but it does capture the typical ones, and it certainly captures what's probably the most popular RPG on the market right now, Dungeons and Dragons. So this is the point in the talk where I lay my cards on the table and I reveal that I've used a bit of clickbait to get you in here, or at least to get the Dungeons and Dragons players in here. Although the title of my talk is Ethics and Dungeons and Dragons, I don't actually use Dungeons and Dragons in the classroom. I use a game that's very similar, or at least I've taken a game that's very similar and I've tailored it to my needs. The game that I use is a game called Dungeon World. It's very much like Dungeons and Dragons. So for those who aren't familiar, Dungeons and Dragons is a high fantasy role-playing game. Players take on the role of adventurers going off to perform heroic deeds. So you have your wizards, you have your paladins, which are basically knights, you have clerics, you have thieves, and then we can keep going with our character classes, but hopefully you get the idea. There are humans, elves, dwarves, hobbits, gnomes, etc., etc., etc. It is a Tolkien-esque sort of world for the most part. And so if you aren't familiar, hopefully you're familiar with some of those tropes. You understand what I'm talking about. As I said, Dungeon World is a Dungeons and Dragons-like game. It is very much kind of an homage to Dungeons and Dragons, but with the kind of modern sensibilities of more storytelling games. So it's lighter on the rules and heavier on the narration. And players have a lot more, I think, autonomy and authority at the table than a typical Dungeons and Dragons table, although again, I'm making gross generalizations here. But this is part of the reason why I use it in the classroom. I use it because I don't need to teach students a lot of rules. And it is more about the storytelling so that we can tell the stories of our characters and through that get to the course content that I want them to learn. So my game is entitled World of Professionals. The game that I've designed is for a philosophy course. The course title is Philosophy 244, Professional Responsibility. It's basically kind of business ethics, medical ethics, engineering ethics, all of your professional ethics kind of rolled into one course. And so for various reasons, I took this course, which is a gen ed course. It is most of the students I have are not philosophy majors. They've never had a class before. They'll probably never have another one again, unless I can hook them in. And so the students that I have come from a wide range of different disciplines going into different professions. And the goal of our class is to get them to think about what it means to be a good professional. The two big elements that I take from kind of the Dungeons and Dragons genre that we'll be dealing with today is that character class. So for those of you who have played Dungeons and Dragons, you know that your character class is basically your character's profession. What I've done is I've taken those fantasy professions and I've pegged them to real world professions. So your paladin becomes your legal profession, your wizard becomes your educational profession, your cleric, medicine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one of the reasons why I use this particular game, is because it already has that built-in focus on the professions. The other thing that I've done that we'll talk about is that I have swapped out alignment, which is your character's worldview, and I've put in its place ethical theory. So if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, you know your characters typically have some sort of worldview class all the way from lawful good down to chaotic evil. I've pulled all of that out, and now instead we've got paladins who follow Kantian ethics. We have clerics who follow the ethic of care, wizards who are virtue ethicists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'll say way more about that as we go through here, because those two components, or at least the alignment swapped for ethic, are going to be very important for our activities today. All right. So that ends my kind of lectury, rambly portion of this presentation. From here on out, I'm hoping for us to get hands-on, to get engaged. And so before we do that, maybe I'll go ahead and pause here. And so on on the Zoom app, there's a button that says participant on it. If you hit that button, it brings up a menu, and there's a green check mark there with a yes beneath it and a red X with a no. If you've got questions, we'll go ahead and field some real quick here. If you've got a question, hit the green check. I see a couple here. Let's see, one disappeared. Got one, maybe, but I don't see it. Kristen, do you see the green?
I saw it when I checked it for myself, and I had it for a minute on somebody else. And again, if you would like, we can go ahead and open up the ability to unmute themselves to folks. You know, it's just a matter of, I have a quick mute all if I need to. So I'm going to go ahead, if you'd like, I'm going to allow participants to unmute themselves.
Sure.
So if they have questions or comments. And, you know, we'll leave that open as long as we don't have any reason to close it down.
That's great. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions at this point about anything, feel free.
There was a question in the chat, if you didn't see it. Arthur had asked where he could find the game. If you're referring to either Dungeons and Dragons or Dungeon World, they're readily available online. You're probably referring to what I mentioned about what I use in the classroom, which is not yet available. It is, so I'm putting it out through WordPress. It will be an open educational resource. Hopefully sometime this summer that'll be available for anybody who wants to use it to download and use. But unfortunately, it's not available right now. I'm sorry for that. Let's see.
I have a quick question. Would you mind explaining a little bit more about the modern professions and which fantasy profession they align to? I really like that idea.
Sure. Yeah, because we probably, I mean, the more I think about it, we probably won't deal with a whole lot of that today because I was going to focus on the ethics. So yeah, it would be good if I say something up front about that now. Because, as I said, my course is a gen ed course, and I get all of these different students from all of these different disciplines. A problem that I was finding before I gamified the course was that there was no way for me to touch on all these different professions these students were going into. So what I tried to do was to narrow it down to 5 professions that are written a lot about in the literature. So I narrowed it down to law, medicine, engineering, education, and business. And so then I pegged the Dungeons and Dragons professions to those real world professions. So for the legal profession, as I said, I did the paladin, which for those who aren't familiar, that's kind of like your knightly profession in fantasy medieval world. In my game, that knight becomes the legal profession. We mostly focus on the ethics of lawyers. For the medical profession, that's the cleric. For those who aren't familiar, in Dungeons and Dragons, the cleric is a combination, sort of like a priest, but it's a priest that says healing prayers, oftentimes. And so that's why I pegged that to the medical profession. So in my game, clerics are most often doctors. It's the kind of problems we deal with in the classroom. For the business class, I got super uncreative and just made them merchants. So they're basically fantasy medieval business people. They used to be thieves, but there were some problems there with making the business people thieves. So I made them business people. The education profession is the wizards. I did that mostly because in the fantasy literature, wizards are supposed to be wise and learned. And so that seemed to fit well with the education profession. And finally, for the engineers, they are artificers. If you're familiar with D&D, I want to say 3.5 onward, the artificer is a character class. They're basically engineers, but that work with magic. And so in my game, science is just, or rather magic is just science we don't understand. And I made the engineers into these artificers. And those are the 5 professions we do. So every player in the classroom gets one of these professions, regardless of whether it's their actual profession or not in what they're studying to do. Sometimes students will choose what they're actually studying to do. So I get a lot of engineers who choose to be artificers. I get lots of people in the medical professions and in nursing, pre-med, etc., choose to be clerics. But sometimes people just like playing something that they're not having to study in every other class. So I get students like that as well. I think I've rambled to a point where I don't know if I'm rambling about anymore. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that absolutely answers the question. Thank you.
Cool, thanks.
And then in the chat, Nicole asks, how much background do you have to give your students before you start playing the game, or is the game central to the course from the beginning?
Yeah, so we start the game on day 1. So I hate the dreaded syllabus day. So we don't really do one, we just start playing. So on day 1, we start making characters and we play all the way to the end. I don't really front load them with a lot of stuff. We do spend the first couple days kind of talking about it, and I post materials for them. We use Canvas, so I post materials to Canvas for them so they can look at things on their own. But really, my kind of thought behind the game is the same thought I have behind learning philosophy, is that like they'll learn it as they go. There's no point in front loading them with everything. I tell them up front that if it feels weird, don't worry about it. If it feels hard, it will get easier. But we just pick up the game as we play. So I don't really do a whole lot of kind of upfront information about the game. I kind of let them find that on their own if they want. Otherwise, they learn it as we go. Yes, syllabus date is the worst. Although most formal thing, most traditional things are the worst. So I try to get rid of them if I can. Would it be possible to get an outline or structure of your game before you formally make it available this summer? Like start working on something for fall term. So at the end here, when we get to the Q&A at the end, I've got some links. One of those links is to my personal website. It's a horrible, horrible website in terms of it being a blog that I started years ago and hasn't been updated since I started it. But what is useful is there's a link to all of the, well, most of the talks I've given, as well as to my materials for my course. And so that's already available online. You can take what you want, use it however it's helpful, but I'll give that link out at the end and you all can have at anything you like. I'm not sure if I've missed any other. Let me check the chat here real fast.
I think the only other question I saw that might not have been addressed directly is, do you think this game could be adapted to other disciplines like communication studies?
Yeah, so what I use it for primarily is the students to learn ethical theory, for them to start thinking about problems they might face on the job, or just to think about ethics in general, just what it means to be a good professional and a good person. And so a lot of the stuff I do is focused on kind of theory application, or about kind of more practical ethics where they're actually thinking through problems. So if in something like communication studies, if you do case studies where students have to kind of work through how they would approach a situation, I think this game could totally work for that, because I do a lot of that. If there's any sort of theory that they need to learn, it could work for that. So if anything, you've got any sort of scenarios they need to think through, or any sort of theory or conceptual stuff they need to apply, I could see it working for that as well. Okay. I'm gonna keep chugging along here. Does that sound good, Kristen?
Doesn't do you a bit of good to answer if I'm muted. Yeah, that sounds great.
Awesome. All right. Oh, how do you make this a virtual activity? So, yeah, we're actually going to do that today. We're going to do what I do with my students in the kind of the virtual classroom. I'm having to do, this was an idea. So when I proposed this talk for the ELCC, I had only been thinking about adapting this for online, but obviously with the current situation throughout the world, I've been doing this online now for several weeks. So we're going to be doing together what I've been doing with my students in the classroom for the last few weeks. So without further ado, let's talk about character creation. So here, this is from the Player's Handbook for D&D 5th edition. It reads, your first step in playing an adventure in the Dungeons & Dragons game is to imagine and create a character of your own. Your character is a combination of game statistics, role-playing hooks, and your imagination. Once completed, your character serves as your representative in the game, your avatar in the Dungeons & Dragons world. As I said, my game is a Dungeons & Dragons-like game, so we do exactly the same thing in my game. On day one, we start making our character. And so, if you follow this link here, it will take you to a folder with some resources that we're going to use today. I'm actually going to, real quick here, stop sharing this screen so I can share another one. So what you should see, actually I probably jumped out of that too fast. Let me put that link in the chat just in case we didn't get it.
I was going to say I had 90% of it, but I missed it. I got the down to utk/edu/ what was the last part of it?
Here it is. I'll stick it in the chat for everybody. There's the link.
And it's not going to be clickable, but you can copy and paste it into a browser, folks. Zoom has made those links not clickable as a security measure.
So when you get there, what you'll see, I'll go ahead and share this. So you should see a screen that looks something like this. What I've placed in here for today, I've placed the very first file is the reading that I give to my students. That is the basis for one of the activities we'll do today. The second file labeled Playbook 1 is kind of the starting character. So that's what we're going to work on right now. The following 5 are the professions that their starting characters turn into. We won't do a whole lot with these. We will do a little bit with them for one of the activities, time permitting. But we're going to start with this Playbook 1 of Villager. So you should have access to that. And if you don't, if for some reason it's not letting you access that, let me know. But when you open that up, I mean, and this is exactly what I give to my students the first day of class. Great. Thank you, Kristen, for letting me know it worked. And actually, I'm going to pull it up on my PDF reader just so it's easier for me to mess with. So I'm going to share a different screen here. Okay. So I've got it on kind of the full page view so you can see the whole page at once on my screen share here. So the first page really is where the character lives. And we're going to do kind of a modified version today of character creation that I go through with my students. Before we do that, real quick, I'll just kind of explain what the rest of this is. So the second page is just a notes page. The third page is just entitled Player Principles. We're not going to do anything with this, but I give this to my students. As I said, most of my students have never had a philosophy course before. They'll probably never have one again. And this is my attempt to give them kind of a crash course 101 in one page. When I teach Introduction to Philosophy, what I teach my students is a lot of kind of attitudes as how to approach material, how to approach big questions. And so a lot of this is principles that I like them to keep in mind while we're playing the game to help them be good philosophers. That's what most of this is. There is some practical stuff in here about how to make arguments, but I give this to my students on day one in this class because, like I said, I don't have time to give them a 101, but I do refer back to it throughout the semester to kind of remind them how they want to be approaching the material in the classroom. This final page here, the fourth page, these are the basic mechanics for this game. So those of you who've played Dungeons and Dragons, you probably like rolling polyhedral dice. I do too. I don't roll dice in the classroom anymore. As you can see here, there are moves that say like +1 CT and -1 CT. That stands for character token. I've switched to a token economy instead of dice. The reason behind this, I gave a talk a couple of years ago. A participant in the audience asked me point blank, he just said, what's the point of the dice? And it made me realize that, yeah, the dice rolling is fun, but pedagogically, it really serves no purpose. If I want my students to learn to make good arguments, it seems like a penalty to then have them roll dice after they make an argument to see if they're successful or not. So instead, what I did was basically, if they make good arguments, they gain character tokens, and they can use those tokens to do stuff they want in the game. Again, we're not going to worry too much about this in game. I'm going to tell you all what I tell my students on day one. We're just telling a story together. If at any point I think that you are triggering one of these moves, I will bring it to your attention. But otherwise, we're just going to tell a story. I'm going to set the stage. I'm going to give you challenges to overcome. I'm going to pose questions, and you're going to answer them. What would your character do and why? Right? That's for this game, the most important part is why you do it. It's not just what you do, but it's why you do it. So, like I said, this is all here for you to reference while we play, but don't worry about it. Just worry about telling a good story that makes sense. All right. So to get us into this first activity, go ahead and go to that first page of Villager. Unfortunately, this PDF is not form fillable, so you'll need to take notes somewhere else, either on a piece of paper, or if you have a PDF editor, if you can download the PDF and just edit it. However you want to keep track of your stuff is up to you, but we're going to create a character right now. So if at any point I move too quickly, or you don't understand what I'm talking about, or you've just got a question, feel free to throw it in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on it to make sure that if I move too quickly or anything like that, I can slow down and explain what's going on. So on our character sheets here, your first line, that is just your name. Right? The PT line, we're not going to worry about. For my students, this is a whole other talk. I'm just going to briefly mention this. So in my classroom, I use what is called Specification Grading. There's probably some of you familiar with this. In Specification Grading, students create complete packages of assignments to get the grades they want. It can be a rather unforgiving grading system. And to kind of balance that out, students get tokens so they can drop assignments they got bad marks on, excuse absences if they don't have an excuse, just buffers for them so that they're not totally screwed over if they mess something up. But we're going to ignore that. Let's do the next line is our character name. Go ahead and name your character. If you need a name, if you can't think of one, just jump on Google and type in fantasy name generator. There are 8 gajillion sites. They all have fun generator names. Next to CTs, we're going to go ahead and start with 1 character token. This way you can go ahead and do one of those moves that's really cool, even if you haven't made a good argument yet. So we've got our character name. We've got our character tokens. Under ethnicity, you've got some choices here. What I give my students are the standard sort of fantasy ethnicities, at least for this game. You've got human, you've got elf, you've got dwarf, you've got halfling or hobbit, and you got goblin. So those are our main ethnicities that we use. Now, if you're a D&D player and you want to play something else, that is perfectly fine. The ethnicity is just for fictional purposes. I've had students play automatons. I've had them play gnomes, tieflings. So whatever you like in the ethnicity, you can just default to human. That's typically the most populous ethnicity. Gender, again, we're going to do, just to keep things easy, we'll do male, female, and non-binary. Typically in the classroom, I use non-binary just as an easy catch-all umbrella to indicate that we're dealing with neither male nor female, that it is a non-binary gender, but of course that captures all kinds of genders. It itself is not a gender, but for sake of ease, those are the three that we refer to. For body and mind, what I'd like you to do, think about your character. Try to get a picture of them in your head. In terms of the body blank, what is the physical feature that people would most notice upon meeting your character? Doesn't have to be the thing that defines them. It just has to be the thing that's most prominent about them. Go ahead and list that. The way this will work in game is that when you're doing something, let's say that, I don't know, maybe you need to reach for a key that is in a hole in the wall, but it's way far into the wall. Maybe your character's got really long arms. That's their body trait. If you've got long arms, and you talk about your long arms as you're reaching for that key, then you have a better rate of reaching that key than you would if you didn't have those long arms. It's basically like getting a free character token by referencing who you are. There's a move called Know Thyself. So whenever you reference anything about you and when you're doing something, it gets you a character token. Mind is the same thing. In your mind blank, think about what mental or personality trait you have that would be most noticeable upon meeting your character at first. Again, it doesn't have to be their most defining feature. It doesn't have to be what they are in total, but what is it that people would most notice about them? Are they calm? Are they quick to anger? Whatever it is, recorded there in the mind blank. All right, so at this point, we should have names. We've got one CT. We should have an ethnicity, a gender, a body trait, and a mind trait. So for occupation, this would be something that I would typically have the students choose from. I have some tables to roll on. To keep things easy, just go ahead and pick a fantasy medieval occupation for yourself. This is not your heroic adventuring profession. This is not even a profession in the sense that we typically use the word. This is your day-to-day grind that your character goes through, because they're going to start out as lowly, squishy villagers. So what crap job do they have to do to get through their day? To put food on the table, to make sure that they don't end up without a roof over their heads. What do they do? All right. The profession blank, we're gonna leave that blank for now. Hopefully we'll have time to fill that in before our session's over today. The party and the guild blanks, we're not going to worry about that. That's something I do with my students. I have them name their adventuring party, which is the group we're kind of making now. Adventuring parties are made up of 5 students. They share eventually different professions. So that way I've got, in a class of 25 students, I'll have 5 different adventuring parties, and each adventuring party will contain one of those 5 professions. So I'll have, each adventuring party will have a paladin, an artificer, a merchant, a cleric, and a wizard. The professional guilds, I then have 5 professional guilds where the students get together in a second group where they all share the same profession. So they've got 2 different groups throughout the semester. Their adventuring parties are activities that don't depend as heavily upon having a viewpoint or an ethic. The professional guild activities depend very heavily upon having an ethical theory upon which we're applying, which is why they have that shared professional group. But we're going to leave those blank. We're not going to deal with that. Those 3 symbols in the middle of your villager sheet there, the symbol on the left is your damage die. That would be the die that you will roll if you ever trying to hurt something or someone. The symbol in the middle, the shield, that's any armor that you might be wearing. That if something tries to hurt you, the armor will take care of it first. So if you were to take 4 points of damage and you were wearing 1 armor, it would soak 1 and you would only get 3 points of damage. The heart, that's your health. That's how much damage you can take. If you take all of your damage, you drop to 0 and you die. And we've got ways to deal with that. There's a move called Last Breath where you face death. So for our squishy little villagers, in that first polyhedral kind of cube shape, you can put a 4, because you would roll a 4-sided die if you were going to try to damage anything. In the shield, you put a 0 because you're a villager and you can't afford armor. And in the heart, you put a 4 because you're a squishy little villager. All right. Down towards the bottom here, you've got 5 slots for gear. What that means is that your character can carry 5 things at any one time. Go ahead right now, look at your occupation, and figure out 2 or 3 things that your person might have on them. If you're a farmer, you might have a pitchfork, and maybe you've got, I don't know, a couple of pigs. Oh, and if you have, like, say if you had 2 pigs, that would only take up 1 line on your gear slot there. If you're a, oh, here we've got an example, a rake, a shovel, a knife, and a mean goat. I love it. Let's see, if you were a bricklayer, maybe, you might have some bricks, maybe a trowel. If you were a apothecary, maybe you've got a mortar and pestle, maybe some herbs for healing, whatever it is that your occupation might have, go ahead and list a few things there. Last but not least, we won't kind of take time to do this, but just so you're aware of what that's for, there's a empty box down in the lower right corner for you to draw a portrait of your character. Incidentally, this creation of this villager page here, this might be familiar to some of you, maybe not to others. This comes from a game called Funnel World, or at least I've taken parts of a game called Funnel World, where you literally start out as a villager and you eventually become a hero. That game itself is based on an older game called Dungeon Crawl Classic, which is really just about creating these squishy little villagers and sending them into meat grinders where they just eventually die in these dungeons. If they're lucky enough to survive, they become professionals. My class is not quite as lethal. So, all right, so hopefully that gets us a basic character. It might be a good time to ask for questions real fast again. So maybe we'll do the manage participant button or the participant button again. If you've got a question, you can hit that green check mark and let me know. Don't see any. Either I've been incredibly clear. Oh, or Kristen says folks can unmute themselves. Either I've been incredibly clear or everybody's asleep, one or the other.
No, I don't think many people sleep in your class. I'm getting that sense.
No, not. I'm lucky enough to have figured out how to avoid that one. All right, I don't see any questions. Cool, then we will go ahead and move on. I'm going to stop sharing this page and I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint so we can go on to our next activity. So let's go back to here. Let's go slideshow, current slide. All right, so thank you for that, Kristen. We got an hour left. That'll certainly give us time to do what I have planned next, hopefully to at least get a taste of what's going on in the third activity. But up next, I'd like to go on a dungeon crawl. So the 5e, the 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide has this to say about dungeons. It says, quote, many D&D adventures revolve around a dungeon setting. Some dungeons are old strongholds abandoned by the folk who built them. Others are natural caves or weird lairs carved out by foul monsters. Dungeons are also home to ancient treasures, coins, gems, magic items, and other valuables hidden away in the darkness, often guarded by traps or jealously kept by the monsters that have collected them. So what I use dungeon crawls for, you can see there that I've got a little subtitle in small print, virtual escape rooms. What I do with my dungeon crawls, we tend to alternate back and forth between dungeon crawls and the third activity I've got planned for today if we have time, monster encounters. So what we do for a dungeon crawl day is I give the students a reading, which is what was in that shared folder, that short excerpt from Kant's Metaphysics of Morals. That's an example of the type of reading I would give to my students. So I give them a reading. The readings have guided questions. Hopefully it helps them kind of get through the difficult material. Before they come to class, they have a really short quiz to complete on Canvas. It's a multiple choice, and the questions are based off those guided reading questions. So if they've done the reading and they've found the answers to the guided reading, they should have no problem with those that quick quiz at the beginning of class. That quiz lets them know if they found what they needed to find while they were doing that reading. They then come to class and I run a short dungeon crawl for them. So they take their characters, they go kind of searching for treasure. And the way they solve the puzzles and overcome challenges on this dungeon crawl was by using what they learned from the reading. So usually my dungeon crawls, and you'll see here in a second, they have a concept room, which is some sort of puzzle that has them use the concepts from the reading, or at least show that they've got a basic understanding of the concepts. And that concept puzzle then leads into a room where there's some sort of encounter where they've got to engage with an argument from the reading. And so I'll just remind you real quick here. Yep. So if you don't have that folder open, there's the link again, and I'll put it in the chat again. Because you're probably going to want access to that reading to help you with this dungeon crawl. Or maybe not. Maybe you know Kant. Or maybe it's just a really easy dungeon crawl and I haven't done my job. Either way, we're going to go ahead and do a dungeon crawl now. What we're going to do is I'm going to describe this first room, and it will come up in the PowerPoint here. I'm actually going to play Dungeon Master and describe this room for you. You'll have an opportunity to ask any questions if anything's not clear. And then once we've got questions out of the way, I probably should have asked if we had this possibility. I assume we do. I'm going to split you up into breakout rooms. Kristen, do we have that possibility?
New Zoom user here. Give me a second to see what I can do. Yes, I see breakout rooms at the bottom. I can choose how many rooms, and we can either manually or automatically break those out. So yes.
Cool. Yeah. So for my
I've
classroom,
learned today.
Cool. So I will, I guess, give you the cue when we want to do that. We won't do it just yet, because I do want to describe the room for everyone and make sure that we get all questions out of the way. So here is your dungeon crawl. So I want you to imagine, so this is what I tell my students anyway, there are a few things going into this dungeon crawl. So one, I tell them to imagine that the reading they did, that the quiz they took, any notes they took, any outside research they did, all of that prep, they need to imagine, you need to imagine that all of this prep is gathering clues to help solve puzzles in the dungeon. All right. So that's the first step. The second thing I ask my students to think about is that, so for this particular dungeon, you're all still villagers. You are searching for powerful objects that will help your villagers become the professionals they want to be. And so this particular dungeon is the dungeon of Kantian ethics. This is the dungeon where the villager, or one of the villagers from the adventuring party, will find the mark of faith that will allow them to become a paladin. So with that in mind, you enter a room. Across the room from you is a door. Beside that door hang 2 torches. In the center of the room stands a statue. And from where you stand, it appears as though there's a flag on the base of the statue. What do you do? So I think at this point, before we go into our breakout groups, does anybody's character want to do anything? Look around, search for stuff. Aha, somebody wants to examine the statue. So when you, we'll do, so there is a move called discern realities. That's to find things that are hidden or valuable. I'm going to say that this is pretty obvious. So when you go up to examine the statue, you see that it's not a flag at all, but it's actually a puzzle. The puzzle looks to be some sort of word jumble. It has one set of jumbled words labeled imperatives. Beneath that, another jumble where you have labeled formulas. So there's a phrase on the left and a word to the right. And beneath that, 4 jumbled words and phrases labeled duties. So the first is you must not blank yourself. The second is you must not blank others. The third, you must blank yourself. And the fourth, you must blank others. So I think this would be a good time to ask if there's any questions before I throw you into breakout groups. Are there any questions about anything in the room, anything not clear? Seeing no checks and no chats. So Kristen, I think if you want to do the automatic sort, we've got, wow, 44 people out there. If we do, I'm not good at math, 9 groups, Oh, people are dropping, they're leaving. They're scared away by the breakout groups. All right, we're down to
I'm seeing, yeah, we're down to 38 participants. I'm seeing 7 rooms with 5 or 6 people per room.
That'll work.
All right. Boom. And I'm going to just automatically divvy them up.
So you should see an invite to go to a breakout room. I've been invited to breakout room 4. So go ahead and accept those when you see them. All right. So Kristen, you're still in the main room, correct?
Correct, as far as I can tell.
Okay.
Again, newbie Zoom user.
So what I'm gonna do, because I did that thing that I always do, where I probably didn't give them time to look at this puzzle. So I'm gonna screenshot this and drop it into that shared folder for them so they've got it. And then, well, let me do that first. There's a function so that you can send a message to all the groups.
I see that.
So once I get that in the folder, you can go ahead and send a message to them to let them know it's there. Let's do. Save that real fast.
All right, I don't know if it.
Yeah, and unfortunately you won't see it. So the only way to know if it was is to actually be in the breakout room. Not the best design.
Okay. And then I've got somebody who's asking for, breakout room 4 is asking for help. So I'm going to go join that room and see if I can help them. They were just looking for the puzzle, and I had hit that message faster than you'd uploaded it.
So it looks like some people are having problems talking to each other in the breakout rooms. I don't know if they're still muted or.
We just weren't sure what we should be discussing in the room.
Aha, yeah, that might have been helpful. Let's do this. Kristen, can you bring everybody back in here real quick?
was just another request for the link. We're good. And the purpose of being in the room is to solve that puzzle, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Apparently did not make that clear.
I think they understood it. They just weren't, you know, every once in a while they get a little shaky about, like, is this really what I'm supposed to be doing?
Mm-hmm.
I think they were fine.
Yeah, I'm used to being able to jump around to the different groups and talk to them, but I guess as a co-host, I don't have that capability.
Oh, yeah, the problem is if I make you host, then
You're not.
I don't have my, yeah, exactly.
That's fine.
And we do have a batch of folks who have not joined breakout rooms, but
yeah, I see that.
they may have solved the puzzle. I actually, if you were looking at the chat, I think we had a solution posted in the chat.
Yeah, I saw that. That's part of the puzzle. Before, I think that was before we went into the breakout rooms.
Yeah, well, that happens. So you tell me whenever you want to close rooms. We're right at 2 p.m. our time, 4 p.m. yours.
Okay.
By the way, go Vols. I have a whole bunch of family who were, my brother-in-law was originally from Tennessee.
All right on.
So.
All right, so
okay.
I'm gonna guess, because it's been about 8 minutes. That should be plenty of time to get this puzzle, so.
Let's see. I have maybe one room that looks like it's still got people in. I'm going to jump into breakout room 2 and just ask how they're doing.
Okay.
Once we solved the puzzles, were we good to come back to the?
Yeah, I think we're gonna bring everybody back here in a second anyway.
Okay.
All right, I think we're pretty close. You want me to go ahead and close all the rooms? You're muted, Ryan.
Thank you. Yeah, you can go ahead and close them up if they're all done.
Okay, I think so. Here we go. That'll give them a minute. It's going to give them 60 seconds to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I will find my chat window again. It's fun when you have 3 screens and all of a sudden you move one thing and everything is all in a different spot.
Uh-huh.
I am very lucky. When I started having to work from home, I essentially had the same setup at home that I did at work, and I am not ungrateful. Okay. And so Mary is asking if you were, would you do this in the classroom as an activity? Would you break them up into groups?
Yeah, so the this is very similar to the puzzle that I ran for this dungeon crawl. For the one in the classroom, it wasn't a jumble, it was just blanks, so they had to fill in the blanks. I thought for the online, it might be helpful to have a jumble. Just it's basically the same puzzle, just not as many hints in the room. Good. So, and then is this similar to how you've done it, dungeon crawls? Yeah. So, yeah, for the past, well, when we first, so UT went kind of closed down just before spring break. So we came back from spring break. I had a couple of weeks of doing this. And now we're actually, because the class that I teach it gets them a communicating orally credit. So we're actually doing presentations right now, which means that my students design and run their own dungeon crawls for everybody else. But they do the same thing that I do. They go into breakout rooms, they run their dungeon crawls, and so yeah. That is what we're doing right now. So I'm guessing everybody's back in the room. Looks like I managed to scare off about 10 people. So I'm going to go ahead and keep moving unless there are any more questions. Yep, I'm getting ready to throw that up right now. Here comes the puzzle. So let me share my screen again. And I didn't think to do it until you were already in the breakout rooms, but I did put a screen capture of the puzzle into that shared Dropbox. So, but here is my screen. So I'm guessing people got it. I saw, I think before you even went into the breakout room, somebody managed to figure out the duties. So if you look in the chat box there, looks like Mary got the unscrambled duties just before you all went into the breakouts. I apologize, I see some questions here. I apologize for kind of the lack of communication while you're in your breakout groups. Usually in the classroom, sort of like Kristen was able to do, was able to jump around to the different groups. In the classroom, I usually kind of rotate around to the different groups, check on them, answer any questions they've got. I was not able to do that. So, all right, we've got our duties in the chat there. So it was, you must not kill, you must not lie to others, you must not, or you must better yourself, and you must help others. These are all in the reading. Most of that reading, if you looked at it, focuses on how Kant kind of explaining how we derive these different duties or how these different duties relate to the categorical imperative, which was one of our blanks. So did anybody manage to get the first blank there? If you did, you can type it into the chat. Yep, we got categorical and hypothetical. So in that reading that my students have, those are the two imperatives that Kant discusses. As you can see from the puzzle, the hypothetical doesn't get a lot of attention. Kant obviously says more about it in the reading than I do here. The reading that's in that folder, if you looked at it, it is just, I went into Project Gutenberg and took the foundations of the metaphysical morals they had there, and I trimmed it down for my students, just so they could focus on the stuff that I really wanted to talk about in the classroom. So for our imperatives, we had hypothetical and categorical. How about our formulas? All right, formula of humanity was the second blank, and universal law for the first. Awesome. So, so real quick, I'll do the 5-second crash course Kant here. Kant gives us 3 different formulas of the categorical imperative. I only go over those 2 in the class. It's typically what most people do for an intro like this. The universal law formula. In a nutshell, this formula just says, or it's asking for consistency in our ethics. The way that Kant talks about it is asking whether or not our maxims contradict themselves. But really what I tell the students is what we're looking for here is kind of consistency in how we act. We don't want to make an exception of ourselves. We don't want to require other people to do things that we wouldn't require of ourselves. Right? The formula of humanity basically says don't use people, right? All people have things they want to accomplish in life. So you should not use others to accomplish what you want to, at least not without their consent, right? So this is my attempt to get a very basic concept puzzle for the students to make sure they've understood the basics of Kantian ethics from that reading. And so once again, we've got, and I'll just unjumble it here. We've got our hypothetical imperatives, our categorical imperatives, our universal law, and our formula of humanity. And those 2 formulas give us reasons for why we have duties not to commit suicide, not to lie, to improve ourselves, and to help others. Mary's got here, do what I say and do what I do, not do what I say, not what I do. A Kantian rephrasal for the modern day. So there's our word jumble, right? Is there any questions about that? All right, so I don't see anything in the chat. We've got about 15 minutes till I wanted to, why don't we do this? I'm gonna go ahead and just show you all kind of the, I wanna examine the statue again to see if there's anything else there. So real quick, I can answer Lisa's question more easily or more quickly. When I do it, it is synchronous. So right now I've got 3 courses that I teach all on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it's all synchronous. I've not had a chance to attempt it asynchronous, although I'm trying to develop things where it could be done asynchronously. So making these types of puzzles in very basic kind of programs online like Twine and things like that. But that's all very early and none of it's done. But everything I do now is synchronous, yes. So Eric wants to examine the statue again. So I'll say this, Eric. You've got a move called Discern Realities. We'll just say that everybody's, we'll say this is a group Discern Realities here. There are 2 questions that can be asked with Discern Realities. One is what here is not as it appears to be. The other is what here is useful or valuable. So let's say I saw Eric ask first. Eric, which question do you want to ask there? What here is not as it appears to be. So let's say this. This is kind of a cop-out on my part, but I'm going to do it anyway. So what appears to be an ordinary statue is not, because as soon as you solve the puzzle, two items appear in the scale that Justice is holding. On the one side is the artifact that you have come to this dungeon in search of. It is the Mark of Faith. This allows a villager to train to be a paladin, and it's also an artifact that they use in some of their moves. Most notably, they have a move called I Am the Law, where they can explain to others why reason requires that they do something, and they must brandish their Mark of Faith in doing so. So you found the artifact you came here for, and in the other, you find, although, here we go, a large iron key. Let's see. Mary wanted to do something here. Mary, what would you like to do now that we have our Mark of Faith and our large iron key? All right. What would you like to do with the large iron key? Do you want to examine it? All right. Yep, sure. So nobody, although we didn't really have a whole lot of time to play this out anyway, but the door was in fact locked, and the iron key opens the door. I think in the interest of time, what we might do here, unfortunately, I'm not sure how much we'll have time to play through. This is one of the things I've found doing this stuff online and doing it with the breakout groups. It really eats up a ton of time that wouldn't happen in the classroom. And so I'll just say this, like if anybody plans to do anything like this online in a synchronous classroom, doing the breakout groups and like presenting the puzzles, ducking into the breakout groups to help students with the puzzles, like it takes so much more time online than in the classroom. It's possible you all have experience with this and you've already found this out yourself, but I'm discovering this for the first time this week. So that's a long way of me explaining that I think we'll just kind of go through the rest of the activities that I had planned, and maybe we'll just talk through them as a large group instead of doing the breakout groups. So you use the iron key on the door, and you open up into a second room. Again, we have a door at the back of the room with torches on either side. Standing in front of this door is a massive stone golem. What do you do? And at this point, we'll just say anybody can type anything they'd like to do into the chat. All right, we got a couple talking to him. All right, so those who want to talk to the golem, I come in peace. So, so you step forward to say, I come in peace. And before the words can leave your mouth, the golem throws up his arm and says, you shall not, you shall not. Oh, what's the use? And he collapses onto the ground and begins to cry. What do you do? All right, I see a help him from Tracy. Comfort him. Oh, that's from Carrie Staples. Hi, Carrie. Gently pat. All right, so we're doing sympathy here. We're going to try to comfort the golem. So as you're comforting the golem, you ask him what's wrong. The golem says, I was created to do nothing but stand and guard this door. My life seems so empty. And he starts to cry some more. What do you do? The door is locked if you try the door. Must be tough for you, seems to be an important job. Take a personality. We're going to administer a personality test. How to make life more meaningful. Ask him to join us. All right, so as you're talking to the golem, he continues to complain. Well, he continues to lament that his life seems to have no meaning. And he intimates without actually saying that he's not sure if he wants to go on. That he cannot take this existence anymore. Got another asking him to join the quest. So, life is unfair. True happiness can only be expected in the afterlife. Come with us. We'll figure it out together. Is there something that Kant might say here? And think again about the puzzle we did out in the, all right, Kantian duty to perfect yourself. Consistent with the idea of humanity. Aha. Have a duty not to kill self. Good. All right. So you can explain to the golem his dignity in taking his own. Good. So it sounds like we're explaining to the golem that he has a duty not to kill himself. That it looks like most people are drawing upon the formula of humanity. All right. So for Kant, committing suicide would be using our own humanity as a means to an end. At least that's one understanding of the humanity formula. Right? And we're not allowed to use any humanity as a means to an end. And what Kant's getting at here is that, well, we'll leave it at that. There's no point in getting into too much detail on that one. The other side, we have the universal law, where Kant basically says that if our desire is to end our life because of our love of life, that we can't take this suffering anymore, that desire is actually what keeps us alive, right? This love of life, and that there's some sort of logical contradiction in our reasoning if that's the reason why we are committing suicide, when in fact this desire, this drive is what keeps us alive. I see other people also trying to get him to develop himself and better himself. So let's say this, between the two, pressing the two duties on the golem, right? The duty not to kill oneself and the duty to better oneself, the golem asks you, in response to your offer to join your party, he says, "What would I do if I joined your party?" What do you say? Smack the door. Can help protect us. Open the door, looking strong, help protect us. So the golem says, "Well, that sounds better than standing here." And he wipes the tears have started to kind of carve canals in the stone of his face, and he tries to wipe them away. And he says, "I have been guarding this door for so long." And with one punch, throws his arm through the door, shattering the wood. It splinters off into the next corridor. What do you do? Carry the artifact, walk through. Yay! All right, and if we had more time and I had put more rooms on the slide, we could go see other rooms. So the key was needed for the previous door that was locked. So the room that you got the mark of faith in, that door was locked, and the key opened that door. So the golem joins your party, and you go on. So when I run this dungeon in the classroom, I've got one room for every one of those duties. So you've got this golem who wants to commit suicide. You have a gnome who is in front of a television eating a bag of holding that's full of potato chips. So it's a never-ending bag of potato chips. And he doesn't want to develop his talents. He's being lazy. You've got a kobold that you're tempted to lie to, but you have reasons not to, thanks to Kant. And you find a baby dragon that needs your help out of the dungeon for the duty of charity. So if I had included those, and if we had time, we could have played those rooms as well. To be honest, in the classroom, we don't often have time to play all those rooms either. I typically prepare way more than we need. We usually only get through the concept room and then one or two of these kind of social encounters. But that is what I've got for you all. Thank you, Kristen, for that. Real quick, before I kind of open it up for any questions here, didn't the golem abandon its duty to guard the door? Oh man, so this is like baiting a philosopher into a discussion that we don't have time to have. Maybe, but I'll just say this. Let's say that if you think about the categorical imperative, does it require us to do things like guard doors? Does it require us to do things that are, let's say, not universal moral duties, but might be positional professional duties? And I'm gonna leave it there. All right, so let me go ahead here, like I said, real quick, so we are running out of time. I love the questions though. So that's it for the dungeon crawl kind of example here. Now, again, we don't have time for the monster encounter. So whereas the dungeon crawls are more for kind of the readings and checking for understanding, the monster encounters are much more open-ended. The monster encounters are meant for the students to think through the different things that their ethics might require of them, might permit them. And so I've got it subtitled here, Gamified Case Studies and Thought Experiments. I do have a quote from our Dungeon Master's Guide, super helpful. Encounters are the individual scenes in the larger story of your adventure. In the class, monster encounters are just my catch-all term for the gamified case studies and thought experiments. What I had prepared for today, which is what was in the abstract, was a trolley problem sort thought experiment, where we have a horde of goblins has invaded the village. They have cornered your king. They offer to stop destroying your village if you allow them to take your king. And that's where the monster encounter ends. If this were in the classroom, we would do our breakout groups. You would get into a group with people who all had the same ethic. That way you could talk amongst 4 or 5 like-minded people who are trying to apply the same ethic to a problem. And I guarantee, even though everybody's got the same ethic, they're not necessarily going to come to the same conclusion, which is kind of the fun of these monster encounters. Yes, this is my horrible Henry VII clip art. But this is the fun of these monster encounters. Eighth? Henry VIII, I am. Yes, Henry VIII. The fun of these monster encounters, though, is that even though they're trying to apply these ethics, just like I tell my students, just because this is something that the ethic seems to recommend, just because this is something that a philosopher says the ethic seems to recommend, doesn't mean it's the only answer to a problem. These problems are all very open-ended. And given the arguments that they can make, the question just becomes, do you have the best argument for why this is the best solution to this problem? Got a question here. Same ethics groups, then do different ethics, more challenging. So typically what we do, and this I have not done online. I've only done in the classroom. I've done the dungeon crawls online, only the monster encounters in the classroom. But typically what we do is they begin in their parties. So the whole party hears a presentation about a problem. They then talk about it in their guilds. So everybody that shares the same ethic, and they try to come to agreement if they can, if not, one or two options. They then go back to their parties and they try to convince each other who's got the best solution to the problem. And so it does get this confrontation between the different ethics going. I'm not sure if that gets to your question, Mary, about same ethics, then do different ethics. But there is a point at which, yes, talk across the lines. Good, yeah, so there's an attempt to get that in there. Once their guilds get some sort of discussion after that, then their parties try to convince one another who have different ethics that they've got the best solution. Again, I haven't tried this yet in the online classroom. I've only done this one face-to-face, but I'm pretty happy with the way it works there. And I'm curious to see how it goes in the online classroom when I get the chance. All right, so in the interest of time here, that does wrap up that monster encounter. Why don't we do this? We've got about, I think, 15 or 20 minutes left. Is that right, Kristen?
Yeah, we're right at 20 minutes now. I was looking at the clock wrong before. Dude, cool. Did math bad. We've got 20 minutes.
Great. So I'll go ahead and I'll just throw it open for the last 15, 20 minutes here. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Are your slides PowerPoints? Yep, those are just super simple PowerPoints.
How do you manage the classroom management facilitation aspect? It's like if you're a game master, you're usually with one party. It seems really logistically challenging to manage 5. Yes,
it
especially
is.
Online.
So I typically, with these, the dungeon crawls, for example, what I do is I do roughly the same thing I did with you all. I present. Once they enter a room, I'll present kind of everything that's there. I do what I'll typically do, so I didn't do this with you all, but for example, I'll pick on different parties. Like I'll actually call out, I'll say like party 1, what do you do? And then we get kind of all the clues on the table that way. So I'll rotate around the room, so we're all doing it as a class. Once all the clues are on the table, I then let them discuss in their parties. And basically, as they come up with solutions, I go to their parties and I hear their solutions. In terms of kind of the managing the class and the time, it really is just making sure that you keep an eye on which parties are raising their hands with solutions. I keep a list of who's raised their hands and who's waiting. And I make sure that if I'm with a party that we're not wasting time. That if there's parties waiting on me, the party I'm with's got to get me solutions. If they don't have something, then I just say, think on it, and I'll be back around. And so it really is me just kind of ping-ponging around these different parties and hearing solutions and really keeping them on their game and not letting them kind of hem and haw and try to figure out solutions while I'm standing there. Does that make sense?
It does. I have kind of a follow-up question though.
Sure.
Sorry. So do you kind of envision it as the whole class coming together at the end and reaching a decision by consensus, and then that's the choice that maybe impacts what happens, or does each separate group make its own choice and then you can maybe summarize things with them later?
Yeah. So I've done this differently. It's kind of evolved over time. So it used to be that I took the consensus of the class and that became kind of what the class did as a decision. I still sort of do things like this sometimes still. So the way I explain it to the class is they have to imagine that they're in a multiverse. And so that whenever any party acts and does something, like say they discover a clue and we're talking as a class, that we have to imagine that the other parties did something similar and discovered that same clue. And so there is that kind of aspect that still happens, but It's gotten to the point where I really do let the parties kind of decide their own paths now. And I mean, just as an example, the third dungeon crawl we do is a prisoner's dilemma type dungeon crawl. That's where they're learning about contract theory. And they get captured by goblins. And this last semester, most of the parties do end up doing the same thing. But I have some parties who join the goblin horde. So they kind of defected from the village and joined the goblins. I have some parties who kind of tricked the other parties and took advantage of them. And so now if they ever meet them again in the future, there's going to be conflict. And so it has evolved to the point where I literally have, like, in every class, 5 different stories going at one time. They're all fairly similar, but there are some of these kind of unique things that stand out that make those parties really different. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Did you put your website in the chat? Oh, Carrie got it for me. Thank you, Carrie. Are there any other questions? It's looking like.
Okay, I don't want to close this down prematurely, and I'm not at all indicating that, but I am going to throw in a link here that is for, that's not going to help you at all. Let's just take the bit.ly portion of that. Obviously, I copied that from my email. That is our, just the bit.ly/ELCC Feedback 2020 is our session presentation survey. If you all could please go and fill that out, we would greatly appreciate it. But obviously, we do still have plenty of time here if you have more questions for Ryan.
Ryan, I have a question about the parties and the guilds. So you talked a little bit about grouping people by what ethical theory they are studying, but also by their profession. And we didn't really get into professions today, but how often do you sort of like switch that around? And are there particular groups that you put together for things like monster encounters versus the dungeon crawls?
Good, yeah, and we didn't actually, you're right, talk much about, I'm gonna stop sharing the slideshow real fast here and pull up something else. So I'll pull up, let's do this, and then, all right. So hopefully you can all see that. So what I've pulled up here is the second playbook for the Paladin. So we played part of the Kantian dungeon. For each of the 5 ethics, there's so like in the kind of character creation portion of the semester, there's 1 dungeon for each ethic. So we start out with the utilitarian dungeon, and that's for our artificer. So the ethic of utility is tied to the profession of engineering. For the legal profession, that's tied to the Kantian ethics. The third dungeon we do is the dungeon of contract theory, and that's for our merchants. The fourth dungeon we do is for care ethics, and that's for our clerics. And then the final dungeon we do in the character creation portion of the semester is for the virtue ethics, or the wizards. And so in their parties, they have these 5 different professions and these 5 different ethics. And whenever they do a dungeon crawl, they're always in their adventuring parties. When we do the monster encounters, which are those more open-ended sort of gamified thought experiments and case studies, that's when they get in their professional guilds. And so in these groups, they have both the same ethic and the same profession. And they always do that for their monster encounters. And so throughout the semester, they're kind of going back and forth between these two groups, depending upon what the activity is that we're doing. And so in answer to the question, those are the only two groups they use throughout the semester. I've never kind of mixed up or like, changed around which ethic goes with which profession, or maybe put different kind of groups together or different individuals in different groups together. It's always been those two groups. So one adventuring party with the 5 professions, one professional guild with all the same profession and ethic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Just because I'm curious, have you ever had any students kind of rebel against the ethic that goes with the profession that when you partner those together?
Yeah, so I've never had anybody like not, so I have had students who have made it known that they do not like their ethic. So that for sure happens. I don't think they know that at first, obviously, unless they've come into the class with some prior philosophy courses. But there are some students who certainly don't like their ethic. There's a couple of things that I try to build into the class to kind of, I don't want to say take care of that, because if they don't like their ethic and they have reasons for not liking it, that's good. And so one thing that they are allowed to do is as they play through the game, is they make the ethic their own. And so we start by reading, for example, Kantian ethics is deontological ethics, but they don't have to stick with Kant as they move through. They can, if they have good reasons, either object to things and remove them, add things that they think things are missing, and it's the same for all of these ethics. So that's one way that I try to get them to kind of engage with these ethics. The other, I'll show this on the wizard page. So there's lots of pages in the second playbook that we don't have time to really talk about. But the third page is where they kind of describe the ethic in their own words. And there's actually a bottom quadrant for this page where I've labeled it curses. And that's where they get to list objections to these ethics. And so if somebody really doesn't like the ethic and they've got good reasons for it, well, here's somewhere I'm encouraging them to actually list those good reasons for not liking this ethic. And then they get credit for removing the curses. If they can find ways in which to get around these curses and make the ethic stronger in their eyes, then they get credit for doing so. And I've just rambled myself into a corner. I guess to come back to the original question, I've never had a student just say like, I'm not going to play this ethic. So luckily that's never happened. Usually if they don't like it, they've got good reasons for it and they're still pretty good about playing the game regardless.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. Check the chat, make sure I'm not missing anything. Don't see anything. Well, if there aren't any other questions, nobody ever gets mad for getting time back. So, Kristen, unless you've got something else to add.
No, just please again, that bit.ly/ELCC feedback 2020 is our session survey. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Ryan, for really, I found it very fascinating. And as a person who often does not engage deeply in philosophy, you've actually made philosophy interesting for me. So that was awesome. Thank you so much.
A very nice compliment. I appreciate it. Thanks. Thanks, Kristen, for moderating this. Thanks to everybody for showing up. I really did not, we've still got 23 people hanging around for these last few minutes here. So thank you for the questions. Thanks for playing. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, if you are done, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting so the recording won't have this whole big gap at the end. But thank you all. And there are sessions starting again at 3 o'clock and 2 more days full of all of these great sessions. Go take a look and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next ones. And then, there we go.